One of the most remarkable properties about literature is where it comes from. We're essentially talking about ink stains resting on pieces of dead trees. And somehow an author can arrange those ink stains in such a way as to create an entire universe that one can inhabit. So building our discussion of setting from last lecture, today we're going to be talking about the Philosopher's Stone and exactly how Rowling did that. Maybe we'll skip the theme song today so we can get straight into our analysis. So I'd like to start each discussion of an individual novel in terms of a little bit of background about said book. Some of this is minutiae and maybe not really relevant to a lot of our literary analysis, but I think that building a context is really important to us in terms of both retaining the information that I'm going to give you and just giving us that constant sense of where this is coming from. As we'll see throughout the course, we're going to put a lot of attention on the sort of industry aspect, the reader or audience aspect, rather than just this idea of the author's intent alone in a room in front of a typewriter kind of thing. So, your background. In 1990, J.K. Rowling was on a train that got delayed. This is a pretty famous story at this point. She claimed that the story of Harry Potter dawned on her there, fully formed. This is probably BS. And from there she began writing. I should maybe go back and explain the cynical BS comment. Okay, so in the modern publishing industry, we keep doing a thing that is actually not that new. We call it the Invocation of the Muse, or Invocatio. If you've ever read the Iliad, it starts by saying, "Sing, goddess of the wrath of Achilles, Peleus' son." Milton's Paradise Lost, Virgil's Aeneid, any epic you can think of, starts out with essentially the first line declaring that the author did not write this book. God did, or a muse did. And the author simply wrote it down for them. So you can see how the strategy would be an excellent way to sell books. Oh, you don't like my book? Well, don't worry about me. This was actually God who wrote it. I guess you don't like God. And as a result of that, you're allowed to create this sort of distance. Now, we still have that today in a weird way. It's not as literal. But what we have is all of our authors talking about how their books came fully formed to them. And it's like visions and dreams. And Stephanie Meyer claims that for Twilight. Stephanie Meyer's college roommate claims, no, she stole it from me from a short story. We know that a lot of our contemporary fiction isn't created in visions and dreams. It's created in workshops and through reading somebody else's book and thinking if I just change a few of these things around, maybe I could do my own version and make a lot of money. But they can't say that because we still have this weird supernatural esteem surrounding the act of writing. And Rowling is participating in that when she claims that it all came to her in a vision. She might be telling the truth. It might have. But every author says something similar, and we know that it can't be every author. So I think we should be skeptical of Rowling's claim, and apologies for shattering any bubbles here. She finished the manuscript in 1995, so 5 years later. That's actually pretty good for writing a first novel. She got an agent, which is a huge accomplishment, by the way, for an unknown writer at that time period. Once you have an agent, you're usually likely to get your book published. From there, her book got rejected by, famously, 12 publishers, as we talked about before. The 13th was the lucky one for them and for her. Now, the first print run of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was only 1,000 copies. To give you an idea how few copies that is, my first book's first print run was 1,000 copies, and my first book is boring and terrible. Now, since then, there have been over 400 million Harry Potter books sold, 8 films made, the highest grossing film series ever, and Rowling is a billionaire. I'm one of the wealthiest women in the world. So before I get too theoretical on you, let's maybe just hit the ground running here. Something I like to do. Here's the opening to Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Quote, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. End quote. So this is where Harry starts. It's not about Dumbledore or Harry or even magic. It's the Dursleys and their banal, ordinary existence, as well as their outright animosity towards anything other than that banal, ordinary existence. So this opening suggests the value of abnormality, something that may or may not be highly significant to the Harry Potter franchise. What it sets up is the notion that this is going to be a book or story about how boring people are boring and unique, hippie-ish, wonderful, magical people are far more valuable, about deviating from the norm, rebelling against conformity, all that kind of thing. Is that a significant theme to Harry Potter? Kind of. Sometimes. It's something that gets picked up in a few key instances, but isn't always there. So this might be a bit of a false start for us, and that's something we'll talk about in the discussion forum. Potentially, anyway. So in this sense, the novel is set up as a story of social inclusion, which is a major theme in the passage that I just gave you. This idea of doing what's normal, avoiding this concept of nonsense. And as I said, Harry Potter very much does conform to that model throughout. For the most part, we have Harry as an orphan raised as an outsider to a hilarious degree. He lives under the stairs. We have entrance into a strange and unfamiliar world, coming back to our discussion of portal fantasy from the last lecture, which again puts him in that role of outsider, someone who is looking to find inclusion. He faces dislike and anger based on his inheritance. This is a constant theme throughout really all of the books, where Harry Potter is looked down upon by his peers. He has certain, let's call it baggage, that prevents him from being socially accepted easily into a group. And frequently he actually cultivates new baggage at the end of one novel that he carries into the next. And everybody thinks he's like a showboat or a liar or an alarmist. You name it. He occupies the key space between major social conflict, which is to say mudbloods versus purebloods, and must choose the righteous path, thus jeopardizing social inclusion. I think it's pretty clear that wherever Harry lands on the mudblood versus pureblood debate is gonna be where the novel lands. In a sense, he has that sort of power to choose. We see him demonstrated very early on in Philosopher's Stone by rejecting Malfoy. He must accept reality in the face of the Mirror of Erised, and reject fantasy. The power to do that is the key to his victory. He must make friends, quite obviously. We'll talk about Harry as a character a lot in later classes, but the power of friendship is very much the key to his victory, in this book especially, but really in all the books. As has been frequently pointed out, Harry doesn't have a lot of traditional heroic attributes, and in fact, he often doesn't solve a lot of the problems except by encountering and discovering them, but he's kind of a magnet for that. Most of the obstacles that Harry is faced with, it's other people who get him past it. So making friends is like powering up from a JRPG perspective. He's leveling up here as a result of dragging Hermione over to his team. She's a good get. It's Persona 5, but in weird Hogwartsy format. He ends this text popular, beloved, vindicated, and he's going to carry that success into his home life. He says, quote, "I'm going to have a lot of fun with Dudley this summer," end quote. So again and again, we see Harry sort of trying to fit in. That's largely what Harry Potter is about. And that social inclusion element is present in the opening, maybe not to the degree or within the context that it becomes more relevant later on in the book and later on in the series. Again, something that we can talk about. Here we see a distinction between the microplot and the macroplot. So microplot is the smaller individual plot, in this case the plot of the Philosopher's Stone, and the macroplot is the overall story of the Harry Potter series. Social inclusion never goes away as a theme, but is it really what the series is about? I would argue no. So coming back to our talk on mythopoesis from our last lecture, the first book has to establish the fantasy world. So if it's so important for fantasy to have this cultivated dynamic setting, we need to recognize that that setting isn't just about the author envisioning it, it's about the author communicating it to the reader, and that takes time. It's to some degree a burden. So as I said, this takes time and space that can be burdensome to things like pacing, which is a kind of competing interest, as we'll maybe discuss a couple slides from now. The problem is you need to establish your setting as effectively as you possibly can in order to immerse the reader in it, which is a huge part of the fantasy experience. But at the same time, this is a first book. This is her first book. And if she spends all this time describing every tree and brick and portrait in Hogwarts. You're going to bore the reader, alienate them, and you're not going to get to make 7 books and 8 films and become super duper wealthy and be on Oprah and all that kind of stuff. So there's a real challenge to world building, that mythopoesis, while at the same time preserving this sense of dynamic pace that creates the interest to allow the reader to experience the world building. You're juggling, you're balancing. Now, if we break down some of the fundamental movements of The Philosopher's Stone as a book, note that it takes, in my edition, the original, 48 pages to establish that Harry might be a wizard. That's a decent amount of time. I don't think it's entirely untenable if this was a story about him just becoming a wizard, but it's a little more than that. We have then Diagon Alley, the platform, the train, the Hogwarts sorting hat, and another further 50 pages to directly establishing what a wizard even is. So it's about 120 pages of a 223-page novel before we actually get to the plot surrounding the Philosopher's Stone. Now, again, coming back to this what did the publishers maybe miss? If I'm a professional reader for a publishing house, I don't know that I'd be willing to bet on an audience staying on board for 120 pages before we actually get to the rising action of the plot. That's kind of intense and extremely counterintuitive. Now, this is kind of the weird thing with the Harry Potter novel. Those 120 pages that I'm describing, that initial world building, those are some of the best and most famous scenes in the entire series. People love that stuff. So Rowling is clearly taking something burdensome and making it enjoyable somehow, which is maybe the ideal possible solution for mythopoesis. So this leads to a question. Why are you still reading by page 119? How does Rowling create tension, conflict, and general entertainment whilst establishing her world and the characters within it? Now, I don't want to steal good ideas for discussion questions, for discussion question responses, but I'll maybe point to like one thing before leaving this to the discussion boards. I think Rowling does a lot with tone and prose in these first 120 pages to a degree that exceeds, I would argue, any other Harry Potter novel or series of chapters. She's very playful with her language in such a way that she's creating this like tone of delight and whimsy. That it kind of goes away as the novel matures, something that we'll talk about. There's, as you probably know, a really cool theory that the tonal level of the book matures as Harry matures. So like the first book is appropriate reading for an 11-year-old, and the last book is appropriate reading for a 17 to 18-year-old. That kind of thing. We'll track that a little bit as we go along. But as I said, Rowling is doing things with her language to allow her to build this world, this setting through mythopoesis without dragging too hard or for too long, which I think is an art in itself, something she deserves some credit for. Now, maybe one way that we can play a little bit with exactly how Rowling is working would be to analyze a key scene. In this instance, let's take on the sorting hat scene. I'm not going to give you a page number because you all have different pages. It's in the chapter called The Sorting Hat, right before it starts singing. Quote, "Maybe they had to try and get a rabbit out of it," Harry thought wildly. That seemed the sort of thing. Noticing that everyone in the hall was now staring at the hat, he stared at it too. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Then the hat twitched. A rip near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. I'm not going to sing to you. Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hat sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts sorting hat, and I can cap them all. There's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see. So try me on, and I will tell you where you ought to be. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring nerve and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you are a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Or perhaps in Slytherin you'll make your real friends. Not a great rhyme there. Those cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap. The whole hall burst into applause as the hat finished its song. And I'm gonna assume you're likewise bursting in applause at my rendition thereof. So if we look at this scene, we can see that she's doing a few different things here. First off, she's doing the Tolkien thing of using song to provide a lot of the exposition and background mythology, something that you might hate if you've read Lord of the Rings, or you might kind of love. I thought it was done well in the movies as a simple kind of interpretation of it. So thus she's creating this intense world-building scene where we're getting a whole bunch of information from something cool and dynamic and interesting and mysterious, in this case, a talking hat, more accurately a singing hat. But again, I did not bring that out in my performance, and you should all ask for your money back as a result of that. Now, related to this, another way that Rowling works through creating interest in the world building is to create tension around Harry Potter. It's this sort of horror movie mentality. I talk about horror movies a lot. I don't know why. I don't even watch horror movies. Anyway, the idea in a horror movie is if you want to make the audience feel scared, you don't show the monster. It's the opposite. You show someone's reaction to the monster first. And you show their eyes getting wide and they're paralyzed and they can't move and all that kind of stuff. That's what creates the sense of fear. So having Harry be kind of gawked at by every human being is the way that Rowling builds the sense of his importance to this world, and thus the sort of stakes of the entire Harry Potter narrative. And we can see this in the same exact chapter, a couple pages down. So I'm just going to read to you again. Sorry. As Harry stepped forward, whispers suddenly broke out like little hissing fires all over the hall. Potter, did she say? The Harry Potter? The last thing Harry saw before the hat drooped over his eye was the hall full of people craning to get a good look at him. Next second, he was looking at the black inside of the hat. He waited. Said a small voice in his ear. Difficult. Very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind, either. There's talent, oh my goodness, yes. And a nice thirst to prove yourself. Now that's interesting. So where shall I put you? Harry gripped the edges of the stool and thought, not Slytherin, not Slytherin. Not Slytherin, eh? Said the small voice. Are you sure? You could be great, you know. It's all here in your head. And Slytherin will help you on the way to greatness. No doubt about that. No? Well, if you're sure, better be Gryffindor. End quote. So in the scene, you again see tension surrounding the building of the world, and in this case, establishing Harry's potential, his connection to Slytherin, and Harry's sense of will is even maybe a heroic attribute in that he wants to choose his own destiny, in contrast to what is being inflicted upon him. That's actually a major theme throughout the rest of the series. So Rowling is doing a lot of her work at the prose level in order to make this thing engaging, even whilst delivering a whole lot of backstory. So let's complicate what we're working with so far a little bit. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are competing interests here. One of the ones we haven't talked about is the, again, modern publishing phenomenon, particularly in the YA market, of telling a complete story, not knowing if the book will become a series, while also leaving the door open for sequels. If you want to get published in the 1990s, as today in the YA industry, you need to have series potential. If you have a YA book where all your characters die at the end and there's no convenient way to bring them back to life, you are not getting published, unless your name is like J.K. Rowling at this point in time. So this reflects the publisher's desire to not commit to a series, to use the first novel as like a testing ground, and if it does even remotely well, then you do a sequel and see if that does better, and then if you do another sequel, and you keep going until Oprah. So again and again, you have these competing interests. You have to tell a complete story to provide a satisfying resolution to the novel in order to even justify creating a second novel. But at the same time, you have to leave some threads dangling in order to demonstrate the potential for this thing to continue moving forward as a series, both to the publisher, as I mentioned, but also, of course, to the reader. You want to create an appetite for more Harry Potter novels. So what's completed in this book? What is sort of tied off? Clearly, we get the social resolution. Now, that'll be undermined again and again and again at like the start of every Harry Potter novel. But he does achieve a form of acceptance and social inclusion at the end of this book, as we've discussed, and will continue to discuss in depth in later classes. Harry does become a wizard. He knows how to do magics. As a result of that, mission accomplished. Harry finds leverage in his relationship with the Dursleys, where before he was tortured by them and dreaded going back to them. Now he has what he perceives, at least, as a position of power. We learn that that's not the case. Again, they undo that a little bit in the next book. Harry makes friends, which is, I know, kind of basically social inclusion, but we can also read it just on that level of lonely kid isn't lonely anymore. Harry finds his place in the world. Again, that whole orphan dynamic, that not knowing who his parents really were, not knowing that he's a wizard, all of that. Now he knows who he is. That's huge. That's absolutely huge. And that thread will be, again, continued throughout the series in different ways. Harry learns the truth about his parents and faces their killer, defeating him. Thus, again, giving him some level of revenge, I would say. Small revenge. And the character dynamics, which I think is an important element that we'll track again in a later class, whereby the fundamental relationship between Ron, Harry, and Hermione, we can call it the trio. We can even extend this. The relationship between Dumbledore, the relationship between Hagrid, not Snape. It's pretty fixed after the first book. I know there's going to be challenges to that, and Ron's not going to talk to him for a while, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, the nature of that friendship and each individual's role within it is concrete by the end of this book. And what you see here in terms of how they interact with each other, that's basically going to be how they interact with each other in the epilogue, when they're all middle-aged and have prostate exams and stuff. Well, okay, in 2 of those cases. So, what's dangling? What's left to carry forward into further books? Voldemort. This is actually a big logical problem in the series. Voldemort is not a full-time job until book 7. We could be charitable and say book 5, but not really. I feel like more people should be worried about that, and Harry should be doing more about that, but he is not. Voldemort is out there. The final conflict is delayed through a process that we'll talk about later on. It's called delay of anticipation. It's, again, common to epics, where you just constantly bring the hero and the villain close together and pull them apart. And wow, you're probably immediately recognizing that Harry Potter really does do that a lot. A lot. We'll talk about it. Dumbledore's intentions. Dumbledore knows things. He's still a little enigmatic. The relationship's fixed. And we'll talk about that. It comes from the school days genre. But there's mystery there. Dumbledore could even turn out to be evil at this point in the text. Unlikely, but possible. Harry's education. This is year 1 of 7. We know he's got more years of Hogwarts. Hey, show me those other years at Hogwarts. Okay. And then what happened on the night of Harry's scarring, which we get a little bit of. We get a much clearer understanding of it, but there's still some mysteries about what went on that night in his house. And those will be picked up later on in the series. So let's take a brief look at that resolution with a reading of the ending of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And if we want, we can make a discussion question on who reads this book better, me or Stephen Fry, and to what extent. Okay, quote, "You must come and stay this summer," said Ron. "Both of you. I'll send you an owl." "Thanks," said Harry. "I'll need something to look forward to." People jostled them as they moved forward toward the gateway, back to the Muggle world. Some of them called, "Bye, Harry. See you, Potter." "Still famous," said Ron, grinning at him. "Not where I'm going, I promise you," said Harry. He, Ron, and Hermione passed through the gateway together. "Oh, there he is, Mom. There he is. Look." It was Ginny Weasley, Ron's younger sister, but she wasn't pointing at Ron. "Harry Potter," she squealed. "Look, Mom, I can see." "Be quiet, Ginny, and it's rude to point." Mrs. Weasley smiled down at them. "Busy year?" she said. "Very," said Harry. "Thanks for the fudge and the sweater, Mrs. Weasley." "Oh, it was nothing, dear." "Ready, are you?" It was Uncle Vernon, still purple-faced, still mustached, still looking furious at the nerve of Harry carrying an owl in a cage in a station full of ordinary people. Behind him stood Aunt Petunia and Dudley, looking terrified at the very sight of Harry. "You must be Harry's family," said Mrs. Weasley. "In a manner of speaking," said Uncle Vernon. "Hurry up, boy. We haven't got all day." He walked away. Harry hung back for a last word with Ron and Hermione. "See you over the summer, then. Hope you have, a good holiday," said Hermione, looking uncertainly after Uncle Vernon, shocked that anyone could be so unpleasant. "Oh, I will," said Harry, and they were surprised at the grin that was spreading over his face. They don't know we're not allowed to use magic at home. I'm going to have a lot of fun with Dudley this summer. And then curtain and applause. And a few people walking out wondering whether or not Harry Potter has become a sociopath. That's okay. It was the 90s. Okay, so last thing for us to do today in this lecture is to look at your discussion questions. So as I said, I want to do a lot of discussion of the techniques that Rowling builds up. I didn't want to dominate that conversation. So I didn't give you a whole lot to work with. Let's see what you can come up with. What other techniques can you see in terms of Rowling's delivery of exposition? How did she establish her world without boring you to death? What was she doing? What was the strategy? What was the plan? Intentional or unintentional? This worked, man. This delivered a ton of world building to a younger audience, which is very difficult to do. They don't have that patience typically, right? Hence why The Fellowship of the Rings is no one's favorite Lord of the Rings book and is just gigantic, and all your friends will say, get through The Fellowship, then you can enjoy the other two. Rowling inverted that paradigm, man. Her world building is delightful and enjoyable. Look to her prose, look to her scenes, look to individual elements. How is she doing this burdensome thing so effectively? And then the second discussion question. Most of you are visiting this novel after having read the entire series, or even just seeing the movies. What attributes of the Philosopher's Stone do you see Rowling abandoning or altering in the broader series? And what do you think was informing those decisions? So coming back to it, how do the individual elements that seem to foreshadow things in the series pay off, not pay off, or get altered or channeled into a different direction? This will get us attentive to structure a little bit, something I really want to focus us on. And again, just to being critical and deconstructive of the text, remembering what we discussed in the opening, that this is ink on paper. Ebook more often than not. Same principles apply though. How did she make a world out of this stuff? What were her techniques and strategies? See what you can do with that, and I will see you in the discussion forums.